Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Mark Updegrove. Mark is the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation and serves as presidential historian for ABC News. From 2009 to 2017, he was the director of the LBJ Presidential Library, where in 2014, he hosted the Civil Rights Summit, which included Presidents Obama, George W. Bush, Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and President Carter. He is the author of many books on the presidency, including Indomitable Will, LBJ in the Presidency. He has written for the New York Times, Politico, Time, National Geographic, USA Today, and has conducted exclusive interviews with 7 U.S. presidents. I read Indomitable Will probably right when it was released, actually. It's been at least probably close to 15 years now. And absolutely love the book. It's a wonderful book. And I wanted to talk with him about Lyndon Johnson. I felt in the book he has such a good pulse on all of, the aspects of Lyndon Johnson. Of course, there's many great scholars out there that have written on Johnson, different pieces or components. I really wanted to get Mark on the podcast and talk about LBJ. LBJ is one of my favorite U.S. presidents, and so it was such an honor to talk with Mark. We start by talking about the elusive figure of LBJ. Who was this guy? What was his makeup? What was his psychology? And really trying to understand a little bit of what makes him kind of work and what were his motivations. Talked about his intuition for politics and how he ascended to the presidency. We talk about the Johnson treatment, kind of this infamous way in which he would manipulate or, convince or charm different people in different ways. There was a whole thing of it, which was really interesting. We talk about civil rights, talk about his wife, Lady Bird, his war on poverty. We also talk about, his, obviously, many of the adventures and misadventures in foreign policy that he had, why he chose not to run for re-election in 1968, his legacy, and many other topics. This was such a fun conversation, one I wanted to have for a very long time, and it was a big privilege to talk with Mark about LBJ. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get over there, like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, contribute, all the wonderful things that I'm very grateful for. Grateful for the audience, people sticking around and still listening to the podcast. It always means a lot. And now I bring you Mark Updegrove. I am here with Mark Updegrove. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am really, really excited to talk with you all about Lyndon Johnson and the book that you've written on him. So big thanks for coming on.
Delighted to be here, Xavier.
No, thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about LBJ. He's one of my favorites. And before we do, why don't you just give the quick snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, and any other relevant things that you're currently into?
Sure. I'm Mark Updegrove. I'm the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. Formerly, I was the director of the LBJ Presidential Library. I am the presidential historian for ABC News and host of the PBS series Live from the LBJ Library with Mark Updegrove. And I'm delighted to be on with you.
Yes. Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you might know a few things about Lyndon Johnson. So you're the right person to talk to about LBJ. Okay. So you've written a wonderful book. It's a few years old now. It's even out in paperback. I remember I got it when it was in the hardcover, and it was I was actually surprised at like how amazing it was in the way in which you wrote it. It was just superb. The book is called Indomitable Will, LBJ and the Presidency. So this will not be about all of LBJ's life or anything like that, but really focusing on the what was it, 5-ish years that he was in the
5
presidency?
years and 2 months.
Yeah. So we're going to focus on that. I guess the first thing I want to ask, just kind of generally here, Lyndon Johnson is a sort of elusive figure. I feel like a lot of presidents tend to be that way in some regard. Um, but he also feels now that we have, 60 years from when he was in office, such a kind of unicorn in some ways of how he was a very good political operative, how he was able to get things done as a majority leader in the Senate and then as president. What do you think it was about his temperament, his personality, maybe his upbringing, that kind of gave him this way of just being very good politically to getting things done, and how he's complicated, both personally and even professionally? What is the sense that we can get of a kind of paradoxical person like he is?
Yeah, I think that you're right. The reason that he's elusive is because he's so complicated. He's difficult to nail down. He's so many things all at once. Bill Moyers, who was an aide to LBJ, said he was 13 of the most interesting people he'd ever met. And depending on who you are, you saw a different LBJ. There were different LBJs based on who he was talking to and what he wanted at that time. In terms of what his MO was, LBJ loved power. There's no denying that. And I think that's the focus for a lot of folks. They see LBJ rightly as a paragon of power, as the ultimate insider in Washington, somebody who intuitively understood the legislative process and was able to get things done, as you suggest. What I think is often lost in the conversation is why he wanted that power, what he was using that power to do. And I think he had this passion for reform. He had this great desire in his life to lift up those who otherwise would have been left behind. He saw through Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal what you could do, in Roosevelt's words, to help the ill-clad and the ill-nourished and those who weren't getting a good shot in American life. And LBJ, to a large extent, used his presidency, his 5 years and 2 months in the nation's highest office, to effectively finish the New Deal. Notably, the one thing that FDR never touched, because it was the third rail during his tenure in the White House, which was the area of civil rights.
It's interesting, this wanting to have this kind of quest for power, but also trying to be considerate of people that need a step up or less fortunate in some ways. There's an interesting kind of polarity there of many people will use power for themselves or in some kind of narcissistic way. And I'm not saying that he didn't use it for himself as well. I'm not lionizing him here in that way. But the fact that it's also used for others as well is interesting to me. I want to ask, kind of continuing the New Deal kinds of things that FDR did. We have all these things he did. I mean, so many things, Medicare, Head Start, civil rights, voting rights, so many big pieces of domestic legislation. But he wasn't, joining the necessarily the big activist movements. He wasn't known as some big progressive. He did this in kind of ugly, dirty, maybe unethical ways. A lot of using politics is messy and it's ugly. And I think that's what makes him so great in some ways, is he got in there and didn't, feel afraid to get his hands dirty, maybe throw some mud back at the other side of things. Is that sometimes what you think, because those are sort of the rules of politics in some ways, unfortunately? You need someone like that. If you want to get big stuff done, you want to get big pieces done, you need a fighter for, the disenfranchised, the little guy, people that need a foot up. Is that kind of the way in which you got to get these things done? Is that what makes him great? How he did these things, not that he did them?
He did great things because, again, he understood the legislative process and he understood people, right? And then part of the political process is understanding the people with whom you're dealing in order to get stuff done. But I would say that he didn't step outside the bounds of power. He didn't do anything, to my mind, that was certainly illegal. Or I would be pressed to think of what he would have done that might be considered unethical. He bent the rules, yeah, but he never went outside them. And I think there are times in politics where you have to figure out other ways to get stuff done if you're going up against obstacles. And LBJ was a master at doing that. Let me give you an example of that.
Yeah.
So voting rights is a perfect example. When John F. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which became the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which LBJ drove into law, there was a very potent voting rights component in there. LBJ stripped it out of there. And he did so because he knew intuitively that the Civil Rights Act would not pass if there was that robust voting component that was included in it. So he looked at civil rights incrementally. Let's break the back of Jim Crow first, get rid of segregation symbolically, and let's move on to voting rights when we have the opportunity to do so. Dr. King and others were pressing him to get civil rights on the book. He was encouraging them to wage the movement so they could have the moral impetus to get a Voting Rights Act through, but he knew he didn't have the votes. So while Martin Luther King was waging the movement, unbeknownst to Martin Luther King, LBJ was doing his very best to figure out how they could uphold voting rights in the South in particular without getting a law on the books. And one of the many things he was considering, for instance, was ensuring that voting rights were upheld by putting the voting registration duties in the hands of postmaster generals, the postmasters that were federal employees that he controlled. It was one of the many things he did. It ultimately didn't come down to that because of the civil rights movement, we got Bloody Sunday, which was something that LBJ could exploit in order to appeal to the conscience of Americans. And then LBJ implored reluctant congressmen and senators to vote for voting rights, and it got through in 1965. So that's a good example of how LBJ was using all the means that he had at his disposal to ensure that voting rights ultimately got done, knowing that if it stayed in the Civil Rights Act of 1963, it probably wouldn't have passed. So you would have neither broken the back of Jim Crow nor gotten voting rights through eventually. It just shows his really intuitive mind as it related to getting stuff done, as you pointed out earlier.
It's interesting because he was a Southern Democrat working with a lot of other Southern Democrats at the time, and it wasn't until 57, right? I think it was right, Civil Rights Act of 57, that he was the one that, I think it was for 12 years or 10 or 12 years or something, he just kind of voted against or whatever. And then boom, right there, that was the turning point and really set up for Civil Rights Act and then Voting Rights Act when he was president. It's interesting, using this example, it's interesting how, I'm trying to think of like a modern example of like someone that would just kind of vote against something or not really have abstain or whatever, and then make a big switch, is really, really interesting to see. Okay, I get some credit, these are people on my side of things, and now I can build that and now use the right time or the right moment to kind of find how I want to do this. But maybe talk about that piece of knowing people in politics or in power, and then knowing to find the right moments to kind of make these kind of decisions or these turns.
I would say you're right about LBJ. And the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which was largely impotent, but for its significance as the first law related to civil rights since Reconstruction, there's no question that's an important thing. LBJ started, though, deviating from segregationist politics long before that. He didn't, for instance, sign the Southern Manifesto after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And he didn't do so because he started amassing his own power. So just for your listeners, LBJ becomes a congressional aide in 1934, establishes himself as somebody who really understands the body politic runs for Congress himself in 1937, gets elected, aims for the Senate soon into his career as a congressman, misses an opportunity to become senator in 1941 in an infamously corrupt election, becomes senator in 1948 in another corrupt election, though one that goes in his favor. And then once he becomes a senator, ascends the ranks really quickly. He becomes minority whip and then minority leader, and then perhaps the most powerful majority leader in the history of the United States Senate. So when he starts ascending the ranks in the Senate, he starts becoming his own man on civil rights. It bears mentioning, though, that I don't think he necessarily had a change of heart. I think his heart was always on the side of civil rights. But this is a practical politician who knew full well that you could not get elected in Texas, to your point, which is acted more like a southern state than a western state, if you were to not to toe the line on Jim Crow segregationist politics. You just would not have been a viable candidate for office. He knew that. So he had to toe the line. But when he had an opportunity to go his own way, notably, again, in his Senate years, and in particular, in his vice presidential and presidential years, he did so without hesitation.
Yeah, it's interesting. This building power of sorts, and how he was doing it his way, really was able to finally use it in the way that he wanted to when the time was there and the moment was his. He gets that kind of suddenly. So obviously there's the awful assassination of JFK in November of 1963. That was a tough time, tough time for the country, tough time for the Kennedys, for the family. It was a tough time, obviously, for him. There's been talk about, some of the complicated relationships with the Kennedys, but it does seem that he was sincere and genuine, right? In what he was very much, very helpful with Jackie Kennedy, and was very, very kind in his words when talking about JFK and all these things. And as soon as he gets thrust into the highest office in the land, you talk about in the book that there was all of these things of this incredible sense of urgency he had right after the swearing in and getting stuff, right there. He's always been a kind of doer and wanted to deliver, and it was very practical, but did he feel, as best you can know, that there was something about the moment of, we're here. This is the moment to really push and to use the space to say, okay, how can we get this done? Let's not wait until after the midterms, or the next election or things like that. Let's try and push forward. What was that urgency coming from so soon after the switch from obviously the assassination, and then he's obviously in the office? What was that urgency?
That's political practicality, plain and simple. JFK gets assassinated, as you know, Xavier, on November 22nd, 1963. LBJ is sworn into the stiflingly hot cabin of Air Force One, becomes the 36th president of the United States. And LBJ realizes that he can do big things in the time he has as an accidental president, not taking for granted that he might not get elected, right? There's a possibility he might not get elected the following year. So he realizes he has this opportunity to take a big leap forward in the area of civil rights in particular, which is coming to boil in 1963, 1964. JFK, as I mentioned, proposed the Civil Rights Act in 1963, did not put a lot of legislative might around this, did not put the power and of the bully pulpit behind it. He proposes it because he has to. He has to do something. It's a symbolic gesture. But again, he doesn't put a lot of weight or emphasis behind it. LBJ sees that he can use the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy and his own sense of the legislative process in order to get it into law. And he knows that will be a gargantuan leap forward in the life of this nation. So he doesn't hesitate to do so. And I want to go back to what I was saying before about LBJ towing the line on civil right on Jim Crow segregation earlier. One of the reasons he's able to ascend the ranks in the Senate is because he engenders the trust of Southern Democrats who more or less own Congress. They have seniority. They've always been a force in Congress going back to earlier in the century, particularly during the New Deal years of Franklin Roosevelt. So he engenders their trust. And then he has to run over these same people in order to get civil rights through because they're mounting these filibusters. In the case of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the longest filibuster in the history of the United States Senate. The person who is leading that effort is Richard Russell, who is probably more of a mentor to Lyndon Johnson than anybody. Russell was the giant senator from Georgia and had the respect of all of his colleagues, but he was a staunch segregationist. Knowing that that Russell, his mentor and friend, is going to get in his way, LBJ invites him to the Oval Office to have a conversation about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And he says, Dick, I'm going to run over you this time. This time we're going to get it all. We had the Civil Rights Act of 60. We have the Civil Rights Act of 57. But this time it's going to mean something. But I'm warning you, in order to get this through, I'm going to have to run over you. And Russell says, Mr. President, I think you can do that. I don't think Jack Kennedy could have done that, but I think you can. But just know that if you do it, if you ram this through, you risk losing the presidency in your own right next year or later this year in the elections, 1964, and you risk losing the party to Republicans in the South. And LBJ listens to this, and there's this pregnant pause, and he says, Dick, if that is the price for this bill, I will gladly pay it. Wow. And you can say a lot about Lyndon Johnson. There's a lot of negative. I don't want to lionize him either. You mentioned that earlier, Xavier, but I think that says a lot
big time
about Lyndon Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. That's very illustrative of kind of sort of that peek into what was motivating him and what his values were and his heart was. Interestingly, it's almost like it's like these two things here. Tell listeners about the Johnson treatment. I don't know what it is. I find it so fascinating. I've seen the pictures. Is 6'4", towering over people, very much in their face. All these things, and he would use it in negative ways, maybe more charismatic ways to kind of use it in different ways. But tell us what it was, right? Kind of describe it, or you can give some examples. And in some ways, maybe it was a little bullying or it wasn't so nice. In other ways, it was very, very charming. But why was this so effective? It feels like only he could do something like this, right? Like other senators, other majority leaders, it doesn't have the same effect. There's something about him embodying that. Just, tell us what it was with some examples and why it was so effective.
It was all-encompassing. LBJ was 6 feet 3 inches tall, and if he were talking to you, he would use his physicality to almost overwhelm you. But the Johnson treatment took different forms depending on who he was talking to and what he was trying to accomplish. So it could be flattery, it could be cajolery, it could be, threats. It could be a number of different things. It could be a quid pro quo. Very frequently, there was, horse trading in the Senate. That's how you did things. I'll give you this if you give me that. Mm-hmm. And so it depended what he wanted, but all different forms. And I think you can hear it in what are the crown jewels of the LBJ Presidential Library archive, which are the secret taped telephone conversations of LBJ doing the business of his presidency. And you can hear in those tapes LBJ talking to Martin Luther King or Bobby Kennedy or Richard Russell or whomever. And you can hear his voice change and his tone change depending on what his relationship with that person was and what he wanted and whether they were resistant to it or not. And my favorite of all of those, and it goes back to the conversation as it related to voting rights, is a conversation that he had with Martin Luther King on March 15th, 1965, Martin Luther King's 36th birthday, when they were both plotting for voting rights. There's the famous film Selma by Ava DuVernay, and I think it totally gets wrong LBJ's posture on voting rights. LBJ desperately wanted voting rights because, as I mentioned before, he didn't have the votes. So you can hear in this conversation on King's 36th birthday, 3 months, make that 2 months before Bloody Sunday, the thwarted march from Selma to Montgomery led by John Lewis. You can hear LBJ urging King to expose through his movement the very worst of voting suppression and of racial oppression. And he's saying, if you get your people to show, the worst of this and get it in the pulpits and get on radio and get it on television and get it in the meetings, then there won't be a fellow who doesn't do anything all day but follow or drive a tractor who won't say, that isn't right, that isn't fair. That's a direct quote. And I think what's amazing about that is you see the symbiosis between King and Johnson in that moment. They both need each other. And LBJ is trying to get him to expose those things because he knows if it happens, if Americans who are fair-minded see that happening, they won't stand for it. That's exactly what went down 2 months later with the Bloody Sunday. And then on March 15th, exactly 2 months after that conversation with Martin Luther King, LBJ gives perhaps his most enduring speech in the presidency, in which he implores the Congress to vote for the Voting Rights Act and eventually invokes the anthem of the civil rights movement by saying, "We shall overcome." A major movement, a major moment rather, in the movement toward equal rights for all Americans in our country.
It's interesting how his the infamous Johnson treatment has different twists and turns depending on what he's trying to accomplish and who he's talking to and what's the relationship he has. It's super interesting. The relationship with Lady Bird, right? His wife is also terribly fascinating. It's, I think, kind of pretty well documented that LBJ had his vices. He wasn't the most faithful in a lot of ways, and he could be quite mean to her in some other ways, but also was super loyal, trusted her completely. Complicated. I mean, all marriages are complicated in their own way, of course, but it was a very, complicated dynamic. I mean, what was anytime I read things about her, she has this unwavering commitment to him despite all of his flaws. I don't know if you want to call it love, you want to call it some kind of, opportunity to take things or really, I don't know, whatever it is, positive or negative, but what was that kind of dynamic when, he goes through some hard stuff? I mean, civil rights, obviously Vietnam, which was really tough for so many years, and many other things. Yeah, what was that relationship like, and how were they partners? How did they lean on each other or not? What was that like?
Yeah, the marriage passes the most important test, which is that it works ultimately. And you're right, it is a really complicated relationship, as all of LBJ's relationships were. No more so than with Lady Bird Johnson. But here's what I think what was, and you're right, he could be very cruel to her. He could be very petty, he could be very mean, he could be very critical. What she said, and I take her at her word, she said, he could be all those things, but he made me more than I would have been. He really stretched her. Lady Bird Johnson was ambitious as a woman in her times. Women were relatively limited in what they could achieve, but she was extraordinarily ambitious in terms of her course of study at the University of Texas and what she wanted to do after she left. She certainly wanted to shake the dust of the little town that she grew up in East Texas and find her way in the world, which says something about her in general. But more specifically, she wanted to make something of her life. And she saw, by hitching her wagon to LBJ, that she could do that. And she did things she would never have imagined she might have accomplished otherwise. That was the price you paid. It was perhaps a Faustian bargain, but that's what Lady Bird Johnson resigned herself to, knowing that she could have, just as he did, an outsized role in the world. And I think her principal role as First Lady, and she should get credit for a lot of things environmentally, not just beautification, which was an important effort, but a greater awareness about environmental preservation, which would, I think, contribute largely to the Earth movement that would ensue, and ultimately what has become modern environmentalism. But what she saw her principal role as First Lady was managing the emotions of the 36th president. That became really important. You have this incredibly volatile, mercurial personality in LBJ who frequently would be bound down by the demons in his consciousness. And Lady Bird Johnson, more than anybody in his life, was able to, if not tame those demons, at least control them for the moment so that he could get things done as president. And she knew if she played that role, that she could get more productivity out of LBJ in terms of what he could accomplish as president. And if you look at what he accomplishes, it is absolutely breathtaking. There is no president, certainly in my lifetime, that is more accomplished legislatively than Lyndon Johnson. He may well be the most important legislative president in the history of our country. And that includes Franklin Roosevelt and Thomas Jefferson and others who got Congress to be pliant to their legislative aims. Lyndon Johnson had this unbelievable power to get things done. And essentially, he creates the foundation for modern America.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that. I really, really do. I think, to me, he's the standard, and to me, it's a high one in terms of what he accomplished legislatively, for sure. On that, he has this war on poverty. I'm curious. You have such a good way of detailing kind of the internal workings of how these things go, and it's really, really nice to get that kind of perspective. He grows up in hill country in Texas, pretty poor, pretty humble. Did he have this kind of emphasis on trying to fix poverty? I know it started with Kennedy. A lot of things did, and it's just a little bit unfair to judge Kennedy too harshly. He wasn't in office that long, but was John? There's civil rights and okay, but with the war on poverty, did he just see this as somewhat personally motivated by his upbringing and background and seeing real folks? Did he understand that, like any kind of time in the United States, economics is what really drives things? You need to have good economic policies. That's what really gets people, it's kind of meat and potato issues, right? Kitchen table issues, whatever. He gets an Economic Opportunity Act passed and builds the Office of Economic Opportunity and uses the power of local communities for poverty programs, which I thought was great. What's the motivation here, I guess, or the various motivations for this war on poverty?
You used a word that I would use in describing LBJ's presidency. You used the word personal. Was this personal? Everything was personal to LBJ. Everything. He personalized everything. And this is somebody who understood poverty. He didn't grow up impoverished exactly, but he grew up seeing these economic vicissitudes come to play in his family life. His father went from rags to riches to rags to riches to rags because of the instability of the economy at that time. And there was no social safety net. And he grew up in small town Texas, Johnson City, Texas, in the Texas Hill Country, Central Texas. Seeing his fortunes, his family's fortunes rise and fall. And there was a sort of stigma around suddenly becoming poor. And the Johnson family was judged for that. I mean, that's kind of petty small town stuff, but it's just human nature in a way. And I think he was very intent on establishing a social safety net. It's remarkable. There's an orientation video at the LBJ Library, which I hear every day when I'm going on the elevator. And frequently I hit a part of the film where or I hear a part of the film where he's talking about poverty. And he gives this speech. We have a clip from a speech that he gives, and he says he is rallying this crowd, this huge crowd of people, and he says, it's my goal to lift up the 30 million people in this country who live in poverty, and we need to liberate them from the shackles of poverty. Are you with me? Will you join me in that effort? And there is this roaring approval, this approbation around this effort. Can you imagine today a politician rallying a crowd around lifting people up from poverty? You have Kamala Harris and Joe Biden rightfully talking about the middle class, but we don't hear about poverty alleviation. That's something that it's pretty astounding. But I think it's also worth noting, Xavier, that so many programs that LBJ put together in the Great Society, they're labeled one thing. This was an education bill. This was a healthcare bill. This was a civil rights bill. But they really were interwoven in so many respects. And let me give you an example of that, and that's Medicare. Medicare is ostensibly about healthcare, right, for our senior population. But ultimately, it's a poverty bill because 1/3 of the nation living over 65 lived in poverty. About 1 in every 5 Americans lived in poverty. About 22% of Americans lived in poverty at that time. But a disproportionate number of seniors lived in poverty, unable to afford the most minimal cost to ensure that they had good health in their elderly years. So that's why Medicare was put on the books, but it also had a potent civil rights component. It ensured that many hospitals that were still segregated in 1965 were desegregated in order to be extended Medicare benefits, in order for the hospitals to benefit from Medicare legislation. So all these things are interwoven. All the goals of the Great Society are interwoven through the laws that LBJ put on the books.
Yeah, it's nice that there's a kind of through line, that there's these big themes where everything's sort of connected, where it's, we're not just doing healthcare, we're not just doing civil rights, we're not just doing trying to alleviate poverty. They all kind of mix. There is a twinge of populism with LBJ, just a twinge. I wouldn't call him a populist by any means, but that rousing people to say, like, don't you want to fix this? How can we have better economic? There's a twinge of that, and I think, I certainly agree. I mean, we don't really have a lot of that, and it's something that is so fundamental that it really gets at the core of what everyone has to pay bills every day. Everyone's got to, have, plan their meals. People got to, put gas in their car. Like, it's just such a fundamental thing that it's not surprising that people would be very much on board with that, and that kind of message.
Yeah. And let me just enumerate for your listeners the bills that LBJ got through into law in just 1 year, 1965. And again, LBJ has this intuitive understanding of timing as it relates to, in politics, timing is everything. And LBJ understands that and the ephemeral nature of political capital. So when he becomes president in his own right with what was then the largest electoral mandate in history, he knows that he's standing tall, but he won't be for long, right? That political capital will ultimately evaporate, right? So as he puts it, when a president is first elected, he's a giraffe. 6 months later, he's a worm. So while he was a giraffe, he was going to get as much of his legislative agenda through as possible. So you have in that 1 year, 1965, the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. You have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, the Highway Beautification Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Immigration Act, the most sweeping immigration reform in the history of our country, and the Voting Rights Act. That is 1 year of the Lyndon Johnson presidency, and there's nothing, with the possible exception of the first year of the New Deal in 1933, that even remotely compare.
all of those things are tremendous, but even more tremendous in my case is we're still living with the direct ripple effects of them, with the benefits that people. I mean, you and I know people probably on Medicaid and Medicare. We know like all of these things. HUD is super important. Clean air, clean water. Obviously, some of these things have gone on to be, reformed or other bills later, but we're still feeling direct effects of those things 60 plus years later, which is astounding. It's just really astounding.
That's exactly right. As I said earlier, this is the foundation for modern America.
Mm.
We do not have America as it exists today, particularly in the area of civil rights.
Yeah.
Without Lyndon Johnson, and I think the Johnson treatment, which you talked about, his formidable ability to get things done, and I think in certain cases political courage to do it at that time, knowing that it's going to come at his political peril and expense, and it does in many cases. So it's a stunning leap forward, and as Lyndon Johnson knew, there was bound to be a few steps back before we leap forward again. That's the arc of progressivism in this country. That's what happens. We saw that with the Obama presidency, right? You go from electing the first Black president of the United States, which is a gargantuan leap forward, and then we get Donald Trump, which is a repudiation of that in so many respects. And that's to a large degree what you get with Lyndon Johnson and the laws of great society. There's great pushback on those things later on.
So obviously, we gotta touch Vietnam. A lot of things we could say about that. I'll just try and do big themes here. One interesting thing before we talk about Vietnam, a while ago, you must know him. I talked to Mark Atwood Lawrence. He wrote a fabulous book on the foreign policy of Lyndon Johnson, not Vietnam, right? Because everyone talks about Vietnam. We're like, okay, we get it. Like, there's a lot of missteps there, but interesting to see kind of just generally his approach to foreign affairs, right? He was very solid on domestic, but he sort of tried to use the same kind of way of different personalities, how to maneuver power. It's much more complicated on the world stage, what he did in Brazil, what he did in other parts of Asia, what he did in Africa, trying to, maybe a leader stays here, maybe they're not the best, but we can at least have a presence there, trying to find the ways to maneuver some of the personalities, sometimes successful, sometimes not. I guess, what was it like a blind spot for him in terms of foreign affairs? I mean, obviously Vietnam was my goodness, a tremendous headache in a lot of ways. What was his kind of overall ethos of like how America is in the world and how they do or do not get involved in conflicts or how they're trying to have a presence or not? What was that overall thing that was driving him on foreign affairs?
Yeah, it bears mentioning that Mark Lawrence is a really good friend, and he and I co-teach a class on Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. A great guy, and his book, The End of Ambition, is something I would recommend as well if you want to understand LBJ's overall view on this. Mark is certainly an expert in that area. Listen, let me just touch on Vietnam, which was, we know now, a colossal mistake. It was a quagmire, and LBJ knew that. I talked about those telephone conversations, and there are several that are haunting. As you hear an anxiety-ridden LBJ trying to figure out how he goes forward. And he says very presciently, I can't win and I can't get out, and it's the biggest damn mess.
Yeah.
That's a direct quote. He knows those things, but the reason that he can't get out is there's too much political pressure to stay in. We have to bear in mind he takes the presidency just a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Cold War still very much defines geopolitics. There are two superpowers. We certainly subscribe to the domino theory. LBJ did, just as JFK did, and believes that if you let one nation fall to communism, that there could be the consequence of other nations falling in turn as the Soviet Union and China becomes emboldened to take countries that are of greater geopolitical significance. So that's why LBJ thinks that he has to take a stand in Vietnam, and indeed he escalates the war, again, to his political peril. It costs him enormously. I think there is a blind spot on Vietnam as we go further into the conflict. It bears mentioning, Xavier, that JFK upheld the notion of escalating the war in Vietnam. He sent in advisors, more or less troops, to train South Vietnamese forces. 2 months before he died, he asked whether it was still worth the U.S. military being directly involved in the conflict in Vietnam. And he says yes, and he doubles down on the notion that he subscribes to the domino theory and that we need to have a presence in Vietnam as a result of that. Whether he would have pulled back if he had remained in the presidency remains to be seen. There's not a shred of evidence that suggests that he wouldn't. Lyndon Johnson, we know, did. He escalated involvement. He didn't pull out troops as many were urging him to do later on in his tenure. And his approval rating was slipping as his credibility around Vietnam waned, and he continued to press the cause of Vietnam. Ultimately, he opts not to run again. He steps aside, the last president before Joe Biden to do so, which LBJ does in an announcement on March 31st, 1968. And it's largely because of the pressures of the war and his desire to try to leave the presidency, having negotiated a peace, that it is his motivation in that. But in terms of what he wanted to achieve in the world, I think there is this view that LBJ is not particularly sophisticated in the area of foreign policy. I don't buy that for 1 minute. I mean, if you look at LBJ in his Senate years, he's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As the leader of the Senate, he's deeply involved in foreign policy related issues. He's a catalyst for the development of NASA, which is very much born out of Cold War fears that the Soviet Union is going to gain technological superiority if they dominate space. So I think he's a mixed bag as it relates to foreign policy. Vietnam is a colossal failure. There's no mitigating that whatsoever or whitewashing it. But I think the one thing that we lose sight of that still exists today, to your point about the lasting legacy of Lyndon Johnson, is that LBJ put into place a treaty that ensured that there wouldn't be nuclear proliferation, that it stayed within the hands of a handful of nations. And it by and large, it has. We haven't seen nuclear power proliferate across the world as we might have to that point, which would have been enormously dangerous. We don't talk today about the possibility or probability of a nuclear exchange between nations, because I think it was managed pretty adeptly by John F. Kennedy with the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and Lyndon Johnson with the Non-Nuclear Proliferation.
Yeah, I think it was talking with Fred Lagevall, who gives. I mean, I'm sure others have as well, but he really tries to give Kennedy his flowers on that and say this is really important. He doesn't get enough credit on this about nuclear weapons and trying to stop that from occurring, and that's obviously born out of all the stuff post 45 or whatever, and trying to make sure that we're able to say, okay, we're not going to have more proliferation of nuclear weapons, and that's unfortunately becoming a little bit more of a concern in the world. Unfortunately, and it's a great thing that there hasn't been other nukes that have been dropped, but not something to just kind of rest on our laurels on either. So, obviously,
sorry, Xavier, I was going to mention, but it bears mentioning too that when Kennedy took the presidency, when Johnson took over for Kennedy, most Americans believed that there would be a nuclear exchange in their lifetimes, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember duck and cover drills in schools. I mean, it was very much top of mind among Americans. And I want to go back to Kennedy. I know this is not about Kennedy, but I've written about him too. My most recent book is about Kennedy. And that LBJ uses the enormous stature that he has on the world stage in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in order to get the nuclear Test Ban Treaty through. I mean, that's something that he put enormous weight behind, and he stood non-parallel on the world stage at that time and used that capital just as I've mentioned, LBJ used his political capital to get something really meaningful done. And the Test Ban Treaty was an enormous step forward as it related to the management of nuclear tensions and buildup throughout the world.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really important thing that is more and more. I think historians have written about and saying, okay, like we need to. This is really important. It's nice to hear that Kennedy can really get some of the credit he deserves. So I'm going to bring this up just because it sort of ends of sorts the presidency, but it also became surprisingly more current. So he decides not to run for re-election in 1968. So a sitting president is not running for re-election, which usually or most do. There's exceptions, but and that happened recently with Joe Biden deciding to he was, and then he said, nope, I'm not gonna. I'm suspending my campaign. I'm not gonna run for re-election. And of course, everyone is out there I'm sure you were getting the calls too about like, what's so similar about this moment from 1968? All of these things. And 1968 is a pretty wild year for so many things, both in the US and globally as well. But yeah, I guess for him first, was it just Vietnam of why he didn't want to try and run for another 4 years? Did he think he was going to just get killed in the election? I mean, as you mentioned, I don't know how much some of these things felt the effect kind of right away, but even in 1965 alone, domestically, there's so much good stuff. Did people just not feel it? Was it just polling was bad? There was no electoral map that could get him, the 270 or whatever it is, or did he just not want to? I somehow think he kind of did, but probably had to read the writing on the wall. Yeah, what was the kind of rationale there? And then if you want, you can talk about maybe some of the similarities or differences with Joe Biden as a sitting president choosing not to run for re-election.
Yeah, several parts of this. Let me start with the precedent. LBJ, the nation was shocked that he decided to step aside. But let me put that decision in perspective. There were 3 times earlier in the 20th century where we had an accidental president. Upon the death of an incumbent, the vice president stepped up and became president. Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, and Harry Truman. Every single one of those presidents did exactly what LBJ did, right? Just Theodore Roosevelt decided not to run. Won the presidency in his own right, decided not to run. So did Calvin Coolidge, so did Harry Truman, and so did Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, I think, had talked to Lady Bird Johnson about this. They had talked openly about whether LBJ should run in 64, let alone 68. And she suggested, she implored him to run in 64. I don't think there was any question that Lyndon Johnson would have done so. But in 68, I think there had been talk very early on about him not doing so, not running again. The circumstances, let me talk about LBJ and where he stood with the American public. His approval rating had waned, and there were a number of reasons for that. Number one, the credibility he had around the war, the divisions that were growing around the war. The Tet Offensive showed that regardless of what we threw at the Viet Cong militarily, the enemy was going to keep on coming. They were absolutely relentless. We have to remember that the Tet Offensive was a huge military victory, series of victories for the American military, right? But nonetheless, we saw that no matter what happened, these guys were going to keep on coming. And that's when Walter Cronkite, in March, went over to Vietnam and proclaimed to the American people that this was going to be a stalemate at best. And the best thing we could do is fold our tent and leave honorably. And LBJ said famously, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. So there was certainly pressure there. He was getting challenges from Democratic rivals, notably Eugene McCarthy and then Bobby Kennedy, both anti-Vietnam War candidates in his own party. And most importantly, LBJ was conscious of a very weak heart that was hereditary. I mean, his grandfather and father had both died of heart attacks at the age of 62. LBJ had had a near fatal heart attack in 1955 when he was just 47 years old. So he was aware every single day that he could put the country through a health crisis by dying in office. He had known what had happened when Woodrow Wilson had a stroke and was on the political sidelines for a year and a half as he convalesced, and how the Wilson administration had deceived the American public about what was happening. He had seen the crisis that occurred when Franklin Roosevelt died in the presidency in 1945, and how ill-prepared Harry Truman was to fill the role of president. I think that was the biggest consideration. And all things being equal, if LBJ had won another term in office and had left office in 1973, he would have died 2 days later. He died on January 22nd, 1973. So that was rather prescient on his part. So I think those were the factors that were going through his mind when he stepped aside in 1968.
Any parallels here with Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I think they both did what they thought was in the best interest of the nation. And that's the most that we can expect of any of our president, that our president put the needs of the nation above his own politically and personally. And that's exactly what Joe Biden did. The circumstances, on the other hand, were very different. LBJ did not seek the nomination of his party. In fact, so many folks go back to New Hampshire in March of 1968 and the Democratic primary that was held there, and that Eugene McCarthy got a substantial number of votes. He got 40% of the vote in New Hampshire with his name on the ballot. It bears mentioning that Lyndon Johnson won that contest. He won 46% of the vote, but his name wasn't on the ballot. He was a write-in candidate. But that was enough to suggest that an anti-war candidate could at least get a fraction of the party to support him. So I think that was a factor. I don't have any doubt that LBJ would have secured the nomination, given the weight that he had in the party, and given the fact that primaries were just directional; they were not determinative. So it was those infamous smoke-filled rooms that determined who the nominee would be at that time. And I have no idea, question that LBJ would have ultimately worked the system to ensure that he was the nominee. And I have no doubt that if he had squared off against Richard Nixon, that he may well have prevailed, as LBJ himself thought he would have. But those are counterfactuals that we don't know. And but given who LBJ was, I think there's a pretty good bet that he would have not only gotten the nomination, but the presidency again.
Final question. What is in your mind, the rightful legacy as president overall, but presidential legacy of Lyndon Johnson? And how do we continue to evolve on how we understand him? There was right after, he finished, Vietnam was still going on, people had a really bad taste in their mouth for him. And I'd say over the past 15, 20 years, people really have looked at him much better. History's really been favorable to him. But as we continue to go through time and stuff, how do we understand the legacy of LBJ?
It took us a long time to look at LBJ's legacy with any degree of dispassion because, as you point out, Xavier, that dark cloud of Vietnam was so thick and hung over the legacy of LBJ. But I think as passions around Vietnam recede over time, and now there are so few who remember that era, right? Most Americans were born after Vietnam. We see very clearly the enduring importance of the laws of the Great Society, not only in civil rights, which I think are of monumental importance. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act are as important in our achieving our ideals as our founding documents. There's no question about it. You don't have the United States meeting its most sacred creed of egalitarianism and all men are created equal without the Civil Rights Act. You don't have the full flower of our democracy without the Voting Rights Act. You don't have huddled masses yearning to breathe free on American shores without the Immigration Act. Those alone are transformational. Add to that all the other laws of the Great Society, and I think there's no denying that Lyndon Johnson is in the top quarter of all presidents, in my view, in the top 10, in either the middle or latter portion of the top 10, not in the presidential pantheon with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, but in that next tier with Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, others who had these very important effects on our country as well.
Yeah. Well, Mark, you're so generous with your time and your brilliance and your energy. I'm very, very thankful and very, very happy to talk about one of my favorite presidents. I think he's a fascinating person. I think he's so consequential for the United States, 20th century, and for us still today. And your work is fantastic. Indomitable Will. It's great, and all of your other works as well. So really, really, really big thanks for coming on, telling us about LBJ, and I'm deeply grateful.
Pleasure being with you, Xavier. Thanks so much.